anything. But you did. No, you didn't. What did I do? What did you do? But I didn't do anything.
He had schizophrenia.
Okay.
And he went into an episode.
What does we go and beat the shit out of them, go and rob them, go and kill them?
I don't know how 3 people go behind a building. 1 person comes out. 2 of them are dead. You're the 3rd person back there and the other 2 are dead. It's bad.
It's 5:53 a.m., Monday, August 1st, 2016. An egg delivery driver named Russ Neesmith swings around the back of a Publix to reach the loading dock.
I noticed some vehicles sitting there, and one of them had the trunk lid open. I think it may have been a van. And then I noticed some people laying on the ground. And then when I got a little closer coming by, I noticed they weren't moving. One of the bodies actually looked like it was naked. I think it was a male and a female. I noticed the male had blood around its head, but I didn't stop to see if they were okay because I didn't know if possibly it was a murder or what.
Motel 2 15 behind Publix. There are 2 bodies on the ground.
Wow, that's strange. They were just kind of like laid out, but I didn't think nothing of it. I just got here.
He thought he'd chosen a back lot where no one would ever find them. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things.
Do you know why you're here today, or what we're investigating, or what's going on with us? What information do you have?
My friend got murdered.
Okay. Does she have a boyfriend?
No, sir.
No boyfriend? Was she seeing anybody?
From what I understood, yeah. But she wouldn't call him a boyfriend, probably.
And who is that person?
Carter Davis, the boy that she was found with.
Okay.
They ask Emma the only question they've got.
Who would want to hurt Natalie?
I really don't know. Natalie was just, like, even to people that she didn't like, she just stayed away from them. Like, if she didn't like someone, she stayed away. I mean, and everyone that knew her, they loved her.
What about guy enemies?
None that I could really know of.
No weapon, no enemy anyone can name, but 2 kids are dead, which means somewhere there's a suspect. So the questions widen past the boyfriend, past the enemies, into everyone Natalie ever spent time with.
She sometimes was not around the best people.
Can you name one of those sketchy people?
Yeah, I mean, Grant, like, I just thought he was completely sketchy.
How well do you know Grant?
I mean, I had, like, a class with him or 2 in 9th grade, but I didn't think he was a good kid, so I stayed away from him. So.
And other than smoking weed, what other type of things does he do?
I don't know.
There is a page, written in a 20-year-old man's handwriting, that investigators would find during the search of his belongings. It is not a journal entry. It is not a letter. It is a set of instructions. Step by step, how to dispose of a body. He wrote it before any of this happened. Before the back lot. Before the mask. Before the gun. Before 2 17-year-olds who had just finished their junior year of high school were found at dawn, lying on the asphalt behind a closed supermarket, shot once each through the head. He wrote it because he had been thinking about this, not because voices made him, not because a man named Matt told him to, because he had been thinking about this for a long time. Monday, August 1st, 2016. Roswell, Georgia. Just before 6 o'clock in the morning, an egg delivery driver named Russ pulled his truck around to the rear loading dock of a Publix supermarket. It was a route he had driven many times. He knew the back lot the way people know any space they visit regularly in the dark, by landmark rather than detail. He noticed a van with the trunk up. He noticed shapes on the ground. Then he got close enough to understand what he was looking at. 2 people, not moving. He kept driving. Called it in. By mid-morning, the scene had been identified. 2 teenagers, Natalie Henderson, 17, Carter Davis, 17, both shot once in the head. No signs of robbery that explained the crime. No obvious connection between them beyond their age and the location where they died. Natalie had just finished her junior year. She wore punk rock band t-shirts that her classmates sometimes mistook for something darker, a misreading she found more amusing than frustrating. She was the kind of person who, if she didn't like you, simply stayed away from you rather than making anything of it. The people who knew her had trouble naming a single enemy. Carter worked at the local Waffle House. He had long hair, a calm manner, and a shift schedule that put him in proximity to the people who passed through late-night diners. He was, by the account of everyone around him, a teenager moving through an ordinary summer. Neither of them should have been in that parking lot. Neither of them should have been dead. Investigators had no weapon, no witness, and no idea yet that the person they were looking for had already started building his alibi. Detectives began with the most direct route available. Who was at the center of Natalie's world, and who in that world had reason to want her gone? The answer to the first question was her best friend, Emma. The answer to the second was harder. Emma described Natalie clearly and simply. Someone who dealt with people she didn't like by removing herself from them. Not someone who made enemies, not someone who carried grudges or attracted them. But there was a name. Not an enemy, more of an unease. A boy Natalie had known. Someone Emma found instinctively off, not someone she could point to with evidence, just someone she had steered away from on instinct. It was enough to add a name to the list. But detectives already had a stronger lead, and for the next 24 hours they would follow it straight to the wrong man. Grant Thalen was 18. He had taken Natalie to prom. He was described, depending on who you asked, as someone who had developed feelings for her that she hadn't fully reciprocated, a dynamic that, to investigators working backwards from a murder, carried a familiar weight. Within hours of the bodies being found, Grant was brought in. He walked into the interrogation room the way innocent people often do, slightly confused, slightly irritated, not yet understanding that the confusion itself can look like guilt. He told detectives he had been home. He said he had no idea what had happened to Natalie. When told she was dead, his response was the kind of layered reaction that grief and shock produce in real time. Disbelief tangled with disorientation. The detectives kept him talking. This is a deliberate interrogation strategy, and it's worth understanding how it works. When investigators believe they have a suspect but lack physical evidence, the conversation itself becomes a collection device. Every story the suspect tells is a story that can be checked. Every timeline offered is a timeline that can be verified or contradicted. The goal isn't confession, and not yet. The goal is to let the person speak long enough that the evidence can either confirm or destroy what they're saying. Grant talked for hours. He talked about boats. He talked about lacrosse. He talked about the last time he saw Natalie, the last time she texted him. He talked the way someone talks when they have nothing to hide and don't quite understand the severity of what's happening around them. Then detectives set a photograph on the table, a surveillance still. Dark hair, a little long, glasses, thin frame taken from cameras near the scene. They asked Grant who that person looked like. He looked at it. I mean, Doc, that could look like me. He wasn't wrong. It could. And for a few hours, the investigation pivoted around that resemblance. Search warrants, DNA collection, an extended effort to either place Grant at the scene or eliminate him entirely. But Grant didn't fight it. He walked them through every point of comparison between himself and the figure in the photo, with the precision of someone who had nothing to hide and found the misidentification more frightening than anything else. His nose was shaped differently, his hair parted differently. He pointed these things out calmly, without defensiveness, with the kind of clarity that tends to read as either extraordinary confidence or genuine innocence. It was genuine innocence. The DNA came back clean. Cell tower records confirmed his location. A receipt found in his truck placed him elsewhere at the relevant time. Grant Thalen walked out. The real killer had been watching the investigation develop from a distance, and he had no idea his face was already on camera. While detectives were running out Grant Thalen's alibi, a separate team was working through surveillance footage from every business along the relevant stretch of road. What they reconstructed was a timeline that told its own story. At 1:49 a.m., a lone male figure entered the rear parking lot of the Publix. He was carrying a backpack and a small fuel canister. He moved through the space without apparent urgency. He seemed to know the layout, or at least, he moved like someone who had been there before. For over an hour, he stayed in that lot. At 3:07 and 49 seconds, he walked directly toward one of the cameras, face first, unobstructed, eyes forward. Then, 5 seconds later, masked. One camera, one person. The footage was clear enough that there was no ambiguity about what investigators were seeing. A single individual who had chosen this moment and this location deliberately had been present long before the victims arrived, and had walked into frame unmasked in a moment of what? Inattention? Arrogance? The particular carelessness of someone who believed he had thought of everything and hadn't? They had his face. They just needed a name to put to it. The name came through Natalie's debit card. Her card had been used at a gas station on Highway 92 at 4:30 that morning, after she was dead. Someone had taken it from the scene and used it to buy gas less than 2 hours later. The gas station had cameras. The car was an older Honda Passport. A search connected the vehicle to a man named Walter Hazelwood. Investigators weren't interested in Walter. They were interested in his 20-year-old grandson, Jeffrey, who had been kicked out of his grandfather's home the day of the murders and had been living out of that car. In the early hours of August 3rd, the Honda Passport pulled into a quick trip on Woodstock Road. Officers were waiting. When they approached the car, Jeffrey Hazelwood was in the driver's seat. Visible in plain view inside the vehicle, firearms, a fuel canister, and a white Guy Fawkes-style mask. The moment officers identified themselves, Jeffrey's first words were not about the two dead teenagers. They were not about the gun. They were not about the mask or the card or the car. His first words were about his wife. Don't mess with her, please. Her heart. It was, as it turned out, exactly the shape of everything he was about to say for the next 2 days. 12:01 p.m., August 3rd. Detective Jennifer Bennett entered the interrogation room before Jeffrey Hazelwood had any idea who she was. The camera was already running, and what it caught, before she even opened the door, was a young man performing distress. Not necessarily fabricating it, but shaping it, emphasizing certain elements, softening others, arranging the version of himself he wanted the first detective to meet. He spoke first about voices, thoughts in his head, figures he could see, commands he was supposed to carry out. He described a medication that dampened the noise but never silenced it, that loaded rather than lifted the weight in his mind. Bennett listened. She read him his rights. He waived them. Then he started talking about Matt. Matt, as Jeffrey described him, was a man he'd encountered a few times. Someone he'd smoked with. Someone who had, on the night in question, gotten into his car and directed him toward that parking lot. Someone who had threatened his wife, his family. Someone who had issued commands Jeffrey claimed he had no choice but to follow. The Matt story was constructed carefully. It had geography, specific locations, a rough sequence of events. It had motive. Jeffrey was protecting his wife, his family. It had a built-in explanation for his presence at the scene. He was coerced, compelled, not the author of what happened, but a reluctant witness to it. Bennett didn't fight the story, not yet. This is minimization, one of the most effective interrogation approaches in cases where a suspect has already committed to a version of events. You don't challenge the lie directly. You accept the frame, ask clarifying questions, and let the suspect keep building. Because every time they describe what Matt made them do, they are describing in precise detail the actions of the person who actually committed the crime. Which meant that every time Jeffrey explained Matt's instructions, he was narrating his own hands. The minimization technique works because it offers the suspect a psychological exit. You can tell the truth without fully owning it. The confession arrives wrapped in someone else's name. Investigators aren't interested in the name. They're interested in the specifics, which only the killer can know. Jeffrey placed himself at the scene. He described the layout. He described the victims. He explained with the kind of detail that cannot be reconstructed from second-hand accounts exactly what had happened in that back lot. And then he explained why he'd gone back to his car to retrieve something without being asked, because investigators hadn't told him what they'd found. He told them. But day one ended before Bennett had everything she needed. Jeffrey asked to come back tomorrow, and overnight, something happened that changed the investigation completely. While Jeffrey sat in a holding area, detectives brought in Kelsey Bonham. She was 24. She was his wife. She was, by his own account, the one good decision in a life he described as nothing but bad ones. The first thing he'd said when officers approached his car was a plea on her behalf. The story he'd built, Matt, the threats, the coercion, was built entirely around the idea of protecting her. And Kelsey initially protected him back. She described him as stable enough, said things had been okay lately, offered the version of Jeffrey she wanted investigators to have. The manageable one, the one that didn't lead anywhere terrible. But the room was patient. And eventually Kelsey started telling the truth. She described what a real episode looked like. Not the medicated version, not the daily one, the full one. The one where he wasn't entirely there. She'd seen him go into that state. She'd seen the shift in his face, the change in his voice. She described a moment where he'd handed her a knife because he was afraid of what he might do with it if he kept holding it. She described the animals. A rabbit. He had told her about a rabbit. He had told her what the voices had made him do to it. And then she said one sentence, not intending it as evidence, not understanding what it would become. She mentioned that when she had told Jeffrey about the murders at the Publix, relaying what her mother had told her. She had included a specific detail. Shot in the head, she'd said. Execution style. She had told him this before his first interrogation. Detectives went still. The manner of death, the gunshot wounds, the specific location, the execution style characterization had never been released publicly. The media hadn't reported it. The police hadn't confirmed it. The only people who knew that Natalie Henderson and Carter Davis had been shot through the head were investigators, the medical examiner, and the person who had done it. Jeffrey had not reacted the way someone reacts to hearing unexpected news. He'd reacted the way someone reacts to hearing their secret spoken out loud. Wait, what? That was all. A pause, a slight recalibration. And then he'd moved on. Kelsey, sitting in the room with detectives, found herself doing the math out loud. She'd described it the way partners sometimes describe terrible things they've had to process. The timeline, the reaction, the sense that something was wrong with how he took the news. And then she said something that arrived before she'd fully decided to say it. He had told her weeks before those teenagers died that he needed to get back into a certain mindset, a killer's mindset, his word. Detectives didn't need to hear anything else from Kelsey. The interrogation the next morning was a formality, almost. August 4th, 12:36 p.m. Jeffrey Hazelwood walked back into the interrogation room voluntarily. He had asked to return. Whatever he was calculating, and he was calculating something, it had led him to the conclusion that more conversation was better than less. He waived his rights again. And then he talked for hours. Bennett let him run. She fed the Matt story back to him, affirmed the details, asked questions that sounded collaborative. She let him feel understood. She let him feel that the version of events where he was a reluctant participant was being taken seriously. And as he kept talking, he kept handing her evidence. He described removing his license plate before entering the lot, something a coerced passenger doesn't typically think to do. He described retrieving the mask from the back of his car, something that requires knowing where the mask is. He described climbing onto the Publix roof and walking along it, stomping his feet, hoping the noise would drive the teenagers away before any of this became necessary. And then, without being asked how he knew he could get up there, he said it. I've done it before. He had been on that roof before the night of the murders. He had planned, surveyed, chosen. The back lot wasn't random. It was selected by someone who had done reconnaissance, who had thought through the logistics, who had written down on a page that would later be found among his things the steps required to make a body disappear. But even with all of this, Bennett was holding something back. A number. When Jeffrey described what he remembered of the shooting, framed, as always, as Matt's actions, he said he heard 2 shots. 2 teenagers. 2 shots. Investigators had recovered 3 shell casings. She asked about it carefully, not as a confrontation, as a question about gaps in his memory, about whether the gun might have discharged during the assault on Carter. And Jeffrey, working through his own account, arrived at the answer himself. Yes, the gun had gone off when he struck Carter with it. 3 shots, not 2. The 3rd casing. Only the person holding the gun would know about the 3rd shot. Matt didn't put that casing on the ground. Jeffrey did. Then Bennett showed him the mask. Not the Guy Fawkes mask recovered from his car. The other one, a marching band show mask. The kind worn in a single season and then stored or discarded. This one had a name written on the inside in marker. Maddie Caro. The name of Natalie Henderson's color guard mentor. Bennett brought Maddie in separately. She remembered the masks issued to the band at the end of a season, the kind of thing you either kept or left behind. She didn't remember keeping hers. Someone had taken it. Someone who moved in proximity to Natalie's world. Someone who had known what the mask was and where to find it. Someone who had worn the identity of a woman connected to Natalie's life while standing in a parking lot with a gun. And then Bennett stopped feeding the Matt story because she didn't need it anymore. She told Jeffrey the truth she had been carrying for 2 days. There was video, not just of a figure in a parking lot, of him entering the lot, moving through it, unmasked, then masked, alone, no Matt visible, no Matt in the trees, no Matt anywhere. Jeffrey's response was not what investigators expected. He didn't confess in the clean, definitive way that closes a case. He sat with it. He moved through a kind of verbal negotiation, not with Bennett, but with himself. The Matt story losing structural integrity piece by piece, until what remained was something closer to an account without the excuse attached to it. He wanted money. He wanted to feel safe. He wanted to feel loved. He said these things without irony, without apparent understanding of what he was sitting inside, without any visible bridge between the wants he was describing and the 2 teenagers who were dead because of them. What makes the Hazelwood interrogation so psychologically dense is the genuine difficulty of knowing where illness ends and calculation begins. Detectives found evidence of both. A young man in real mental crisis and a young man who dyed his hair the morning after the murders, removed his license plate before entering the lot, sourced a specific mask tied to the victim's life, wrote notes on body disposal, and then returned to the interrogation room voluntarily the following day. None of those acts belonged to a person who blacked out. They belonged to a person who planned, acted, and then managed the aftermath. And then came Carter's name. Investigators mentioned it in the course of the conversation. Jeffrey recognized it immediately. The boy whose head he had shot. The boy who had served him food at the Waffle House Jeffrey ate at regularly. He described Carter in the past tense as a server, the one with the long hair, the one who brought his meals. He had killed someone he recognized, someone who had fed him. There was nothing left to ask. The case went to court in the spring of 2017. On May 17th, Jeffrey Hazelwood entered a plea, guilty but mentally ill. The court received a psychiatric evaluation documenting 5 separate diagnoses: hallucinations, suicidal ideation, a history of auditory and visual commands he could not consistently refuse, a medication that reduced the volume of the voices, but never silenced them entirely. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never addressed the families directly. Through his attorney, he conveyed remorse. The families of Natalie Henderson and Carter Davis were left to do what families are always left to do after a verdict: determine what the word justice actually means when applied to someone they have lost. A guilty plea is an answer to the legal question. It does nothing about the other ones, the ones about the last hours, the ones about what those 2 teenagers were doing in that parking lot at 3 a.m, and whether they were afraid, and what the last thing they saw was. Those questions don't get a verdict. They just become part of what the families carry. But the question that lingers longest over this case isn't what Jeffrey Hazelwood did. It's the one investigators were left with when they looked at everything he'd prepared. The voices are real. That much is documented. The diagnoses are real. The suffering, which whatever form it takes inside a mind like his, is not a fiction constructed for a courtroom. But the mask was real too. The page of handwritten instructions was real. The surveillance footage of a man removing his license plate, sourcing a mask, climbing a roof he had scouted in advance, walking directly at a camera unmasked, and then masking 5 seconds later. That is not the record of a psychotic break. That is the record of a plan. The lead detective, asked about the case after sentencing, did not offer a clean summary. He said what investigators say when the thing they've solved still leaves them with something they can't categorize. The plate he removed, the mask he chose, the casings he gathered, those weren't the voices. Those were his. Natalie Henderson sent a Snapchat the night she died.
Jeffrey Hazelwood pleaded guilty but mentally ill to both
Nothing
murders
that announced
and was
itself as
sentenced to life in
final.
prison without the possibility of
The kind of
parole.
thing you
He never
send when
spoke
you're
to the
17
families.
and
Through his
alive and the
lawyer,
night
he said
still
he was
feels
remorseful.
ordinary.
Court psychiatrist found 5
That was the
mental
last
illnesses,
trace of her that her
hallucination,
friends
suicidal
saw
thoughts.
before the morning
Stop
news.
taking the medication meant to quiet the
Carter
voices.
Davis had
But
served
plate
the
he
man who
removed,
would kill
the mask
him,
he chose, the casings he
brought
gathered
him
off
food.
the ground, and the page in his own handwriting
The ordinary
about how to get rid
transaction of a
body.
late-night
Those weren't
diner.
the voices. Those were
A
his.
teenager doing his job. A customer sitting across the counter. No reason to remember it. No way to know it mattered. Neither of them chose to be there.
On May 17th,
The man who brought them there
2017,
had
Jeffrey
written out the
Hazelwood
steps
pleaded
for what
guilty
came
but
after,
mentally ill to both
had
murders
rehearsed
and
the
was sentenced
location,
to life in prison without the
had taken a
possibility of
mask
parole.
that
He
connected
never
him
spoke
to
the
Natalie's
families.
world,
Through his lawyer, he
had
said he
removed
was
his license
remorseful.
plate,
Court psychiatrist found
had
5
spent
mental
over an hour
illnesses,
in that parking
hallucinations,
lot
suicidal
before they
thoughts,
arrived.
Stop taking the medication.
He had
meant
wanted to
quiet
be
the
happy,
voices. But the plate
safe,
he removed, the mask he
loved.
chose, the casings he gathered off the
He
ground,
said this
and
in
the
an
page in his
interrogation
own
room
handwriting
surrounded
about
by
how to
the
get rid of
evidence
a
of
body.
what he
Those
had done
weren't
to
the
2
voices.
teenagers
Those
who
were
were
his.
wanted those same things. Natalie Henderson was 17. Carter Davis was 17. They should have been starting their senior years in September.